So hello, everyone. On behalf of the Decarbonizing the Industrial Supply Chain Energy Initiative, or DISC-E, at the Clean Energy Buyers Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar, The Hidden Carbon in Solar PV. This introductory webinar is based on the low carbon solar primer that we released earlier this year. For those of you that are new to DISC-E, we are a SEBI initiative, formerly the REBA Institute, designed to use the collective power of large consumers to accelerate the market for low carbon industrial commodities that use carbon-free energy. We are currently focused on a couple of different areas, notably solar and building materials, including steel and aluminum. Our solar team hosts a monthly meeting called the Low Carbon Solar Community of Practice that brings together energy customers and other stakeholders along the solar supply chain who seek to optimize the environmental impact of new solar installations and support low carbon growth of the solar market. We'll circle back to this near the end of the presentation. My name is Chandani, and I'm an associate on the DISC-E team, and I will be walking you through this presentation. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Jen, who will be joining me at the end for our Q&A section, and Marielena, who will be dropping various links and definitions into the Zoom chat throughout the presentation for your easy reference. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end. The objectives for this webinar and the low carbon solar primer are twofold. One, to raise awareness of the need and opportunity to decarbonize the solar photovoltaics or solar PV supply chain. And two, to introduce actionable items energy customers can implement to send market signals for low carbon solar PV. So why are we here? As you likely know, solar installations are expected to grow significantly over the upcoming decade as more companies and countries make commitments to zero carbon energy to take climate action and meet key emissions reductions goals. The DNVGL's Energy Transition Outlook forecasts that new solar PV installations will triple by 2030. This is great news and necessary to shift to a cleaner grid and economy. However, this forecasted growth paired with current manufacturing processes means that the carbon emissions associated with solar PV modules, which are currently small in the context of global emissions, are going to become significant and meaningful soon. You may be thinking, if solar is a clean energy source, why is this happening? Well, in addition to the more commonly discussed greenhouse gas emissions from energy generation, every energy source has carbon emissions associated with the manufacturing and installation of new generation assets in the same way that other manufactured goods require energy inputs. So if you look at this graph, you'll see that we have compared the forecasts for solar PV emissions in blue to those of aluminum in black. Why aluminum? Because aluminum is currently the fourth largest industrial commodity from an emission standpoint, representing about 2% of all global emissions. So it is significant that solar PV is forecasted to be nearly on par with aluminum by 2030 and overtake it by 2040. Why is this happening? Solar has projected growth rates that far exceed other industrial supply chains. Again, more clean energy from solar is a good thing, but we have an opportunity to reduce the carbon emissions created by bringing these new solar assets online. So where is the hidden carbon in the solar PV supply chain? Over the lifetime of solar PV or any product, there are 6 main phases where emissions can occur: materials extraction, manufacturing, installation, operational energy usage, ongoing maintenance, and end-of-life disposal. Collectively, we call these emissions the life cycle emissions. Now, let's break this down just a little bit further. The operational emissions, again, what we commonly think about for energy production, are negligible for solar. In contrast, 98% of life cycle emissions from coal-based energy production comes from operational emissions. The hidden emissions in solar PV are everything else, and we refer to that as embodied carbon, so everything in light blue. For solar PV, our focus is actually on upfront carbon, or the emissions associated with the material extraction, manufacturing, and installation phases before it is in use and operational. Upfront emissions are sometimes referred to as embodied carbon as well. So if you ever come across this terminology, just make sure you know how they're defining embodied carbon. In sharp contrast to fossil fuel energy production, 60 to 70% of life cycle emissions in solar PV comes just from upfront emissions. And more than 50% of upfront emissions comes just from the electricity in the manufacturing stage. And this is where we can really get to the heart of the opportunity to curb the emissions forecast for solar PV production. While clean energy is produced by solar, you hopefully realize by now that not all solar is produced by clean energy. And right now, Asia dominates the upstream solar PV market, and the vast majority of PV modules are produced in regions with carbon-intensive grids. So we have a pretty big task ahead of us. However, as I mentioned earlier, the solar PV market we see before us right now is merely 1/3 of what's projected to exist by the end of this decade. As the industry triples, we have the opportunity to build that other 2/3 in a cleaner way and potentially phase out carbon-intensive manufacturing. To meet this opportunity, we have to start now and raise the industry standard for the procurement of solar PV by establishing low carbon solar as the new market norm. And if we look back at our graph from earlier in our presentation, you can see that if we continue with our business as usual approach, solar PV production could contribute almost 2 gigatons annually by 2040. However, if we use clean energy to make solar PV, we could curb these forecasts and potentially avoid 14 to 18 gigatons of cumulative CO2 emissions over the next 20 years. So this is really a huge opportunity that we really can't afford to miss. Right about now, you're probably thinking, okay, this is all great, but how on earth are we actually supposed to do any of this? So we've built 5 actions that you can take to send a strong demand signal for low carbon solar. And those are joining a coalition, developing a deeper understanding, making a public statement, asking for carbon analyses, and updating your project specifications. These 5 actions can encourage increased transparency, better data collection, and create a low carbon ripple effect throughout the supply chain. I'm going to break them up into groups and talk about them in a little bit more detail. I'll start by talking about the first 3. As I mentioned earlier, SEBI has a low carbon solar community of practice dedicated to advancing these efforts. We work to create educational materials like this webinar built around stakeholder interests and developing frameworks and tools that facilitate a company's procurement of low carbon solar PV. There is no requirement to make a public commitment to be part of this community, but we are looking into pathways to send a common signal to the industry. All are welcome, and there is also no financial requirement to participate. And now we'll take a look at the last 2 because those are slightly more technical. So an LCA is a life cycle assessment, a technical method to account for the environmental aspects and potential impacts throughout a life cycle of a project. The scope of LCAs can vary based on the goals of the organization. EPDs are environmental product declarations, which are third-party verified documents based on an LCA to enable comparisons between products fulfilling the same function. An easy way to think about this is that if LCAs are the recipe, then EPDs are the nutritional label. We may have removed all the complex scientific analyses that went into coming up with this label, but I can read it and basically know how many calories are in what I'm eating. If you're interested in learning more about any of these documents and how to incorporate them into your work, the DISCI team will be releasing educational material dedicated to breaking these down further in the coming months. So what can you do with these? Simple, ask for them. Asking for this information from your current and potential suppliers indicates that this is a priority for you and can help you make low carbon decisions down the line. You can also include language in your request for proposals or RFPs about your low carbon solar intention, either by announcing it as a priority and/or setting a specific emissions target for future projects and procurement. For example, you could ask, quote, please submit a third-party verified life cycle assessment, EPD, or other available documents describing the embodied carbon of your solar modules for your project, end quote. On a separate but complementary effort is also underway with the Global Electronic Council. The GEC is a nonprofit that manages EP, which is a type 1 eco-label. Currently, the PV module category is under review and revision to better incorporate ultra-low carbon solar criteria. You can think of this eco-label as a third-party verified EPD with a predetermined threshold for carbon emissions, which should help you judge the best suppliers from an upfront or embodied carbon standpoint. As shown on this slide, creating this eco-label is a lengthy, robust, and multi-stakeholder process. Input is provided by industry experts along the supply chain with multiple opportunities for public consultation. Currently, the process is in the green stage, as shown on the slide, and the final criteria is being developed. The GEC expects to finalize this eco-label by mid-2022. In the meantime, French and South Korean programs already favor low-carbon solar PV in public procurement, and the EU is working to add embodied carbon disclosure into its green public procurement system. So all Tier 1 solar module suppliers have already developed documentation adherent to a French tender system that you can request. So to conclude, the business case for you to promote and preference low-carbon solar is: 1, you can mitigate risk. Energy customers are seeking to get ahead of changing national policies and accounting mechanisms that are considering embodied carbon and working to increase transparency. These actions will mitigate carbon exposure associated with the production of goods purchased. As I just mentioned, French and South Korean programs have already favored low-carbon solar PV, and the EU isn't far behind. So making changes now can help you stay ahead of the curve. 2, you can demonstrate corporate leadership and increase impact. Companies are setting increasingly bold targets and seeking to stand out in the growing group of organizations proactively working towards a zero carbon future. Companies can maximize impact through individual transactions and be recognized as leading the way to a sustainable green economy by bringing embodied carbon into the solar PV project selection process. 3, you can strengthen the solar industry. Low-carbon solar energy customers can help secure the sustainable growth of the solar industry by shifting the industry to address sustainability risks and foster further innovation of new technologies, business practices, and processes to meet low-carbon demands. And lastly, you can create solar jobs. Studies show that new investments in solar create nearly 3 times as many direct and indirect jobs on average as fossil fuel energy sources. Low-carbon solar PV demand can spur new associated value chain production capacity in regions where upfront carbon can be eliminated, such as the US or Europe, where manufacturers can access renewable energy for operations. So I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Before we turn to the Q&A, I want to take a minute to invite everyone who is interested to our next Solar Community of Practice meeting on December 7th. Please send a message in the Zoom chat if you would like to attend and receive a calendar invitation. And for those who are interested in learning more about advancing other non-financial criteria in renewables energy production, I'd also like to encourage you to look at SEBI's Beyond Megawatt initiative. This program continues to grow, exploring human rights and equity issues, grid resilience, and other aspects of environmental sustainability. I'll pause here so Jen and I can answer questions. I believe we have a Zoom Q&A box up, so please put your questions in that. Thank you.